200 people, so okay, not many. Right? These are not famous people, right? So they're not in the news, they're not on TV, but they are, I think, very important in academia, right? So they're not world famous Nobel Prize winners, but I think they are important in our field in a not so good way. So let's see why. Right. Also, just so you can then tune out whenever you want to, this is what I actually want to tell you tonight, right? So if you just take in this slide, then after that, all the rest is sort of an illustration of this, right? So the first point is really just what your mother and father also told you, that you should never just trust other people, right? Or also never trust what people really write in journal articles, even if they've been peer-reviewed, right? Always think for yourself. And if you doubt that things are really what they seem they are, ask for the data, be critical, do your own analysis. And also, in retrospect, you have to do something in return for this as well. What I think we as researchers have to do in return is we should try to use publicly available data and make all our data available as well, that we use and that we gather as survey researchers. Right? And what is important to that as well is that you don't only publish your data, but also that you document them, right? So that people actually know what the data are about. Right? Okay, so the second point I want to make is that survey errors can really be huge, right? Even if they seem small. So I will illustrate that using some examples, and I will finalize today's talk with showing you that actually survey errors can be studied, right? If you know in advance that you want to assess survey errors, it's usually quite easy to include some aspects in your study that enable you to do so. Right? There are messages down in the bottom screen. That's very good. Okay. So the example that I'm going to use today is not so happy. I told you already, and it's not so happy for many reasons. First reason of them is that it's an example about the number of people that got killed in the war in Iraq. Right? As you may know, this is already 10 years ago, right? So the war in Iraq started in 2003 when America invaded Iraq to get rid of Saddam Hussein, and there was a brief war, relatively brief, but after that, an insurgency started that sort of went into a civil war. Rather, what we're sadly seeing now today happening in Syria as well. Although, I mean, it's a very different story, but in Iraq, in the years 2003 to 2007, a lot of people got killed for many reasons. And something that was very important back then is how many people got killed. Right? So the US government especially said that the number of people that got killed was relatively low, or it wasn't really low, but it was about 30,000, they said, which is still very large. But and there were lots of other people that said that this number should be much higher, right? So the question was, how high is it, right? So there were numbers of groups that started to estimate this in different ways, right? There is an overview, a Wikipedia page that I like a lot, with an overview of all these kinds of studies that were done in this period about how many people died. Right, let's just say it's an important number to estimate how many people died. You could also, of course, think about that unemployment figures are more important. Well, perhaps they are, but I think this is a very important number to estimate this because it teaches us something about whether actually how international politics should be done. Right? So whether it is worth perhaps invading a country to dispose of someone that you don't like. Right, okay. So the surveys that I will discuss are 4 different surveys. Right? So there were 4 different surveys that tried to estimate this number, each in a slightly different way, and I will show you how and what numbers they came up with. Right. So method number 1 was actually this was the first survey. So I'm starting with this one for a reason, and this was done by an NGO which is called the Iraq Body Count. Right, and what they did is actually quite simple. They kept track of every news report that was in the news, and they read all the newspapers, and they had people in Iraq as well to verify any reports that were in the news, but they'd also check the local news, and they kept a track of how many people died each day. Right? If possible, they tried to verify these using official hospital records. They visited morgues in Iraq to check whether actually this many people died, and they really did the best they could, and they came up with an estimate that in 2007, between 98,000 and 107,000 people died. Right? You might think, well, why this difference? Well, because they weren't sure of all the reports, right? Some of the reports that were in the media, they couldn't verify. Also, the reverse happened. They found people in hospitals and morgues that there was no news about, right? So they weren't exactly sure, but this was sort of their lower estimate, and this was their upper estimate. So somewhere in between those two. So this was already much higher than what the American government at that time said the number of casualties was. Okay. So there was criticism to the study to the extent that this was very much centered around the urban areas in Iraq. Right? They had many people in urban areas. And also it was criticized for the fact that not all the deaths come into the news, right? Especially those where more people got killed had a higher likelihood of getting into the newspapers and the TV shows. Right? So some people thought that this number was even too low, right? And that in reality it should be higher. All right. Then there was a second survey, which was a survey carried out by the Iraqi government, but it was sponsored by the UN and the WHO as well. And read what they did, and actually this method was quite quickly dismissed as not being a good method to do survey. For two main reasons. First of all, the sampling that they was not to ask this very extensive question. I'm not going to read it out to you. But actually what they asked people is whether there had been a death in their family due to violence. Right? That was their basic question. And for those of you who are in my course, we've talked quite a bit about social desirable questions. Right? This is a question that's quite leading, and there are lots of problems with this question now. Right? It's unclear what a family is. It's unclear what is the result of violence, like what does violence mean, what is it about. Okay, so when this came out, people were actually quite quickly to dismiss this one. And here you see the fourth survey where you see this picture showing up that I showed you first. So I want to spend some more time discussing this particular example, because this is an example of a survey that was carried out by a group of researchers affiliated with Johns Hopkins University, quite respected people in a respected department, and they actually did a survey already in 2004, right? So earlier than others in Iraq, right? Where they found that many people died, but they weren't exactly, the authors weren't exactly sure that their methodology was perfect, so they tried to improve on it and do it again in 2006. Right, so this study was published 9th of October 2006. Remember the date; it's going to be important later on. And their estimate was that there were about 630,000 deaths. Not as much as the 1.2 million, right? But still about 6 times as much as the other estimate from the Iraqi family survey. Okay, so let's take a moment to see how they did this survey. So it was a survey among the Iraqi population, and because they recognized that it's hard to draw a good sample in a conflict area, what they did is they draw, instead of drawing persons, they draw areas, right? So they first picked clusters in Iraq. And they picked 50 different areas, and then within each of these areas, they interviewed 40 households. Right? This resulted in about 1,200 interviews. If you do the math, you see that they don't really add up, but more about that later. There is a good reason for that. There were about 1,200 interviews, and these include, if you include all the people that live in those families, about 12,000 people. The household size in Iraq is apparently quite large. Right? And you might think that this is too large, but actually it seems that the average size of a household in Iraq is actually 10, or at least at that time, because it's quite common for households to include, say, uncles living in, or nephews, or other kinds of family members living in a household. So household size is really quite big. Anyway, so this is an overview of the numbers here. I already told you. You see that we have now 4 estimates here with varying numbers. Right, 100,000, 150,000, 1.2 million, and 630,000. Which one to believe? Well, it's hard to say really, but this one was quite quickly dismissed as being a bad survey, the third one, so we're left with method 1, 2, and 4. And of these 2, I think method 2 and 4 were considered to be most serious. Right, they were done by people who really do a lot about survey methodology. There were samples, they were sampled in slightly different ways, but still good samples. At first sight, there didn't seem to be much wrong with that. But because these estimates differ quite a bit, right, there must be a difference between these 2 surveys, because otherwise, how can they end up with such different numbers? So, if you remember, maybe you remember this, in the media the days after this Lancet study, so this study was published in the Lancet, this last study, in the days after the publication there was a lot of debates in the media about this news report. And even George Bush at his weekly press conference was asked about this number, right, so 630,000. So this is 2 days after the report was published. Let's see what he said about it.
No questions found, but this report was one that go out before. It was pretty well, just the methodology was pretty well described. But I talked to people like John Casey and, of course, the Iraqi government that I studied and talked about the report.
30,000, Mr. President, do you stand by your figure, 30,000?
I stand by the figure that all innocent people lost their life. 600,000 would have been against that. It's just, it's not clever.
All right. So you hear what he says, right? The methodology is pretty much discredited. George Bush knows this already 2 days after the study was published, right? And he said that the authors probably guessed the number of 600,000. Obviously, he wasn't too happy about that. But let's see about that. Right? Okay. After this whole media reports and all these kind of things, there were lots of survey methodologists that, of course, wanted to know, right? Is this number credible or not? And here you see the archives of one of the survey methods mailing lists. There are actually survey methods mailing lists where people write emails to each other about survey methods, believe it or not. And actually, if you look at this mailing list, see, this is all just in about 3 or 4 days, right, on one mailing list. And especially, for example, on the day of the 25th of October 2006. So this was about 2 weeks after the study was published in the Lancet. You see that there's a message about every hour, right, about this topic. So survey methodologists try to discuss among each other, right, is this a good or a bad survey, right? And I must say that at first most survey methodologists were actually quite satisfied with the way people did the survey. If you read the article is available online, you can Google it for yourself. If you read the article, it seems that these people really knew what they were doing. Right, they say something, for example, about non-response, how they sampled, what kind of question they asked, all kinds of things. It seemed to be a really good study. So what were they actually asking? If you look in a bit more detail to the study, what were they asking? They were asking the question, first of all, they didn't ask the question who died, but the question was, who lived in this household on the 1st of January 2002? Right, so this survey was done in 2006, but the question they actually asked, the main question in the survey is this question: who lived in this house in January 1st, 2002? So then they asked, like, can you list the people that lived there? And then the follow-up question was, who was born, moved in or out, or died between now and then? Right, so they not only ask about the people who die, but they also ask about the people who move into the house, move out of the house, and were born. So it's not obvious that the survey is about people who die, right, in that period. Okay, so what did they find? In total, they find 629 people died within the period, between 1st of January 2002 and the date of the survey, right? What they also asked, right, if people said, well, this person died, they said, well, can we see his death certificates so that we can verify that this person actually died, right? And in total, out of the 629 deaths, in 545 cases, people actually presented a death certificate. It's almost 90%, right? So most of the cases, people who said someone died could actually provide some evidence that this person actually died, right? So that's very good. Okay, so now if you break down these deaths, the 629 deaths, these were people who died in the period actually previous to the invasion, so in the years actually 2002 to 2003, because the invasion was in 2003, right? So there were people who died before the invasion and people who died after the invasion. So they asked, like, when did these people die? They got the date. The date was often on the death certificate as well, right? So they can check this. So what they found is that 82 people died pre-invasion and 547 people died after the invasion in Iraq. And from these numbers, you can calculate what is called the crude mortality rate. So what are the number of people that die for every 1,000 inhabitants? So they found that before the invasion, 5.5 people died, right? And this mortality rate shot up to about 13.3 after the invasion. So you see there is really an increase in the mortality rate, right? So after the invasion, a lot more people died than before the invasion. Okay. So this all seems credible, right? And the first thing that actually people started looking at, if you look at the males in the mailing list, is actually people first thought that maybe this mortality rate was wrong. Right, this mortality rate that they actually estimated before the invasion, that maybe that was too low, right? Because if this is higher, right, then the difference between this mortality rate and this mortality rate is much smaller, and because of that, then the number of estimates of the sort of excess people who died because of the war in Iraq would also be smaller. So let's see. This is a map actually of the UN with the mortality rates. I must say that these are the mortality rates not specifically in 2003, because in every country they do this survey in different years. Right? So for some countries it would be, say, in 1999. For other countries it would be in 2005. So it's a bit, the data are not perfect. However, you see Iraq here before the invasion, so this was about 2001, and you see the neighboring countries here, for example, Turkey, Iran, Syria, all these countries here have actually mortality rates around 5. Right? So throughout the Middle East, before the Iraq War, a mortality rate of about 5 seemed to be like a very normal number. So if the estimated mortality rate in Iraq was 5.5, this seemed to be very credible. Right? So, okay, after a while, this was sort of excluded as one possible form of bias in the study. Okay, so then, of course, the next question is, did all these people die because of violence, right? It could be that people died because of worse sanitary conditions, for example, or there might be lots of reasons. So, in the pre-invasion, only 2 of these 82 people that died before the invasion died because of violence, and after the invasion, 300 people out of the 629 people that died in the sample died violently. So you see really that this increase in mortality is really largely due to a number of deaths that's caused by violence, right? So it's because of the fact that of this civil war and of the insurgency that happened. Right. There was also after they also asked like why did these people die? So right, of course they did so. And after doing all the numbers, the authors actually did find as well that there was a slight increase in the mortality rate due to a deteriorated health situation. So even if you take out all the people that died of violence, you're still left with a small difference, and they attributed that to the health situation getting worse. Hospitals not having the proper equipment, all these kind of things. Okay, so far so good. Okay, let's look at it in even more detail, right? So here's this is the terrain of certain methodologies. We go down deep into the details. And in order to do so, you see here a graph which represents the total survey error framework. So all the possible errors that you can get in a survey are represented here. There are two things that can go wrong, basically. There can be something wrong with the number of the people that are in your survey. So the wrong people are in your survey, for example. And there can be something wrong in the measurement. So how you ask the question, for example, what kind of question you ask, how you deal with answers to questions. Okay, so let's go over this table and look at each and every source of error. Right, okay, so let's start here at the top right corner. Coverage error. So did all the Iraqi people did they have a chance to be represented in the survey? Here you see the sample. Right? They drew 50 clusters, I already said that. So they selected 50 areas in Iraq. In total, there were actually 1,297 families, so more like 1,300, 12,801 family members. They found almost no refusals or non-response. Right? So they selected clusters, and here you see all the clusters that they selected. There were here, you see a few areas where there were no clusters selected, the area here and the area here. This one is really a mountainous area that's quite sparsely inhabited, and basically this is mostly desert. So this, I think here about 200,000 inhabitants, and here about 100,000. So they chose not to do clusters there because the areas were just too sparsely inhabited, and the interviewers would have to travel for too long to reach the people. Right. But all the others, they took clusters. And here you actually see estimates as well for the number of deaths per region. Right? So you see that there were quite some regional differences as well, with the areas in the middle of the country being most affected by violence. In the very south and the very north, the violence was much worse. Well, it was much less, sorry, not much worse. Okay. So this is part one of the sampling, right? But sampling comes down to the details. So how did they then, when they selected a cluster, how did they then select families? Well, they did so as follows. They took a cluster, and this is not an actual cluster that they drew. I just downloaded this map for illustration, right? This is an area of Baghdad. I just picked a random area of Baghdad. And you see here that this is called the main street, right? The main road. With some side roads to it, and then lots of residential areas here. Right, so how did they draw areas? Well, so within this cluster they had to select some area to survey, right? It's very hard to, you can of course pick 40 random addresses here in this cluster, but what they did is something different. What they did is they first looked where the main street was, so this is the main street, and then they counted all the streets that crossed this main street. So if you go back to the previous one, you see this is the main street, and then they take all the streets here that cross the street. So this one, there are lots of them, right? And then what they did is they selected one of these streets at random, right? So they picked one of these streets, and then they followed this street, right? So they start in the street at a random house in this street, and then they take that as a starting point, and then they interview people over there. So all these 40 families would be people that would be living in one particular street, actually, in Baghdad, or in a different area. Right. Which also means that there are people, for example, here that don't live very close to the main streets, nor to streets crossing that street, that these people would actually not have a very good chance of being selected. Right? So, is this a good way to do a survey? Well, it's not perfect, as certain methodologists would tell you, right? because it's not random, and there are some people here who have a 0 chance of being selected into the survey, and that's what survey methodologists say. That's not good. The authors say in the article that they had to do this because there was lack of time, and maybe the interviewers felt insecure. They couldn't really travel because there were lots of roadblocks and these kind of things. So they had to take a decision on this, and they felt that this was sort of the best decision they could take. So they don't take a main street, they don't take like a back neighborhood, but they take streets that here at some point, right, cross this street. So if you, for example, follow this street, right, goes all the way here, all the way here, all the way here, all the way here. Well, who knows what happens after this, right? But they will take a random point. So it could be that they actually sample people all the way over here. It's not necessarily the case that they always interview people very close to this main street. Okay, so not entirely happy about this, but okay. So I'll give this I'll say it's okay with a small question mark. Right? So let's look at sampling error. Now the next error source. Well, sampling error is really quite small, right? The sample is large. 12,000 people is quite a large sample. Actually, the number of clusters that they drew 50 clusters, but they used 47 clusters in the end. There's some details about that, but it doesn't really matter. And actually, I would say that the number of clusters is quite low in comparison to the total sample size, but overall, that's about okay. So overall, I would say sampling error shouldn't be too large. Right? It's unclear how they correct it for clustering interviewers, but okay. So then we get non-response error. This is an error source that we generally worry about very much, right? So what did they find? They found a response rate of 95%. You never get this in Germany or in the Netherlands or wherever, right? But we do know that from studies from developing countries, or I mean, Iraq is sort of a middle-income country, that response rates there are much higher than in our countries. So, I mean, you could still say, well, I don't trust it; it's too high. But well, if it's really that high, there should be no problem with non-response error, right? Or a very small problem at least. So we can take that box; it's fine. No problem with non-response error. With adjustment error, there was not much reported in the article, so it's really hard to say whether there was a problem with that. Adjustment error is errors that are there because we as survey methodologists try to correct our data for all kinds of non-response and sampling probabilities that differ, right? But let's assume that they did that right. I'm not sure. No one is sure actually at this point. Okay, so let's go to the other side, like the validity and the measurement error. How did they do? What did they do there? Well, we already discussed this question, right? And who lived in this household on January 1st, 2002, and who was born, died, lived in or out of this household? Personally, I think this is quite a good question to measure this. Of course, you could say, well, they asked about something in the past, right? So perhaps people don't know anymore who lived in their household in January 2002. Couldn't be the case. Right? Perhaps they overestimate the number of people that live there, so that consequently more people should have moved out or something like that. Could be a problem, but that's fine. And actually, what is very strong about this, right, is that whenever someone said that someone died in the family, they had to present this death certificate. Right? In almost 90% of the cases, this death certificate was presented. So we can be fairly sure that all these deaths that were reported were actually people that died. Right? So I would say, again, doing this quite quickly, that the validity and the measurement error for the estimate that we're interested in should be quite low. So overall, here, what do we have now? We have lots of green ticks here that are all quite happy about the survey. A few question marks, right? But they're not too many. And there are about error sources where, well, usually we don't think that these are the largest error sources anyway. So all good, right? Perhaps something was wrong with this other survey, with the other estimates. Perhaps this is the best survey out there. Well, not really. Okay, so here comes the twist. First, a closer look at this sampling, right? This is what survey methodologists started worrying about really first, about the sampling, how it was done. So if you look at the streets that were taken here, right, you should know something about Iraq. Like, how did people die in Iraq because of the violence? Like, what happened? Can anyone remember what happened in Iraq? Why did many people die in Iraq? Car bombs, yes, exactly. So, or other bombs, right? There were lots of bomb attacks, right? And where did the bomb attacks actually take place? Usually not on the main street, because these were guarded quite well by the Americans and Iraqi security forces. There were roadblocks, usually not on the main street, although they did happen there as well. Right? But often where these bomb attacks happened were actually on these kind of streets. So not the through roads, but the sort of secondary roads where it was still quite easy to drive with a car, right? So certain methodologists started worrying that actually people who live on these kind of streets might have a larger chance of being hit by one of these bombs, right? And because of that, if you only survey people who live in these kind of streets, of course, you would find that there would be more mortalities there. Okay, so this might be your first reason, right? This might be actually quite a big reason why there might be something wrong with this survey. Okay, and there was something else. When people started to dig into the data and read the article very well, they found a few things. They found, for example, just taking the dates of the field work and looking at the number of interviewers and the number of interviews being done, they calculated that on average, each interviewer on average did 20 interviews every day. Right? That's a lot, right? I must say, I mean, and the authors say this as well, that the survey was short. Right? I don't know how short, but let's say that it was maybe only 10 or 15 minutes, the survey. I would say still 20 interviews is then a really big job to do in one day. Right? Even if you start early and you work very late, what they probably didn't do, because it wasn't the safest place to be sometimes after nightfall. But 20 interviews is really a lot. Right? So people started worrying that interviews might have actually faked their data. Right? They might have gone into the field, but instead of interviewing real people, they might have just filled in some forms, right, and then giving them back to the fieldwork organization. Another thing is that some people said that there was almost no response, and some people really worried about this. As I said before, there was very little non-response. On the other hand, it does occur that you get a response rate of 95% in developing countries, so, okay, but it's something to maybe worry about as well. And then the final thing, and that was the thing that convinced me really, that there is something wrong about the survey, is about this estimate of the mortality rate and these death certificates that were presented. So they said that for 88% of the deaths, the 600 deaths that were, they were verified by death certificates, right? So they were validated in a way. However, when people looked at the official records of the ministry and the local councils in Iraq, what they did find is they did find lots of death certificates for people, right? But they only find death certificates that would imply a mortality rate of about 7.0 and not 13.3. Right? And this is very strange, right? Because these people had these death certificates at home, right? But they couldn't be found in the administration. Well, you could say maybe the administration was a mess. Could be the case, but why did they then give out the death certificates? Right? That's a bit strange in a way. And of course, this is also connected maybe to the sampling bias. You don't know what is the problem. Perhaps more people died on these roads, or perhaps there's a problem with the interviewers, that they may have faked data, and also faked, right, because the only thing the interviewers had to do was tick this box, yes, I saw the death certificate. And so it was very easy to say that they did. Right? So they may have done that. Okay, so now we get to the final bits of this story about Iraq. The A4 here is the American Association for Public Opinion Research, and it's one of the big survey research organizations in the world. What they get on a press release, and they said the A4 finds Gilbert Burnham, which is the guy in the picture that I showed you, in violation of the ethics code. So what did A4 do? Because many people were very worried about this survey and they had questions about them, there was an official A4 committee that actually emailed questions or wrote questions to the team that did the survey, asking questions about their methodology. Right? Things that were not published in the paper, whether they could provide more evidence of that. And this is a press release saying that he's in violation of the ethics code, and then they published also some further details of why he was in violation of the ethics code. And I know that this is probably too small for you in the back to see this. But so I've taken some things here, some of the highlights from the things that April found. First of all, they found that in the field, another questionnaire was being used than the actual questionnaire that was the official questionnaire, so to say, for the survey. So in the field, the questionnaire was being changed, right? Not really substantially, right? The basis of the questionnaire was still the same, but there were different parts to the questionnaire added and removed. Second, the sample selection was very vague. We already spoke about this, right? It was very unclear how the sample was selected. They wanted to know lots more details about what kind of residential street these were they really big streets or not big streets, how was the random number chosen, what did they do with empty houses, lots of different questions. There were doubts about the quality of the fieldwork, right, so the interviewers. And fourth of all, the researcher did not answer any of the questions that the APO and other people wrote to this team of researchers. Right, so the only thing, well, it's here just off the screen. He did respond to the request by APO by just saying that they followed the standard procedure and that was it. Right, that's the only thing he said about it. Also, he didn't want to make his data public. Right, so the data from the study are not publicly available, nor are any of the fieldwork documents. So APO couldn't check many of these details themselves. Right. After this, there was an investigation into the study by Johns Hopkins University, an internal review. What they did find was that not all the interview data were faked, at least. They could find questionnaires, so the original paper questionnaires. They were there, they existed, they seemed to be filled out. So their conclusion was really that at least they didn't commit fraud or anything, like these researchers. If there had been faking of interviews, it was probably by some of the interviewers, and not by the researchers themselves. Okay, so that's the story about Iraq, right? So even surveys in this study at first sight really seemed to be a very good study, but once you dig in deep, it seems that it's not really. Right? But I can imagine you're tired of Iraq, and I have a few other examples, just a few short ones to make you a bit more happy again. To show you that survey research is really dodgy at times, right? So this is a bit of a happier example. Right, so there are lots of surveys around about happiness, right? And I dug in and I tried to put some of the estimates that people come up with in a row. So here you see what is the World Happiness Study by Ipsos Synovate. It's a big big market research firm, and they're active in many, many different countries. Right, so in all the countries that I think they have an office, they ask this question: how happy are you? It was a scale from 1 to 5, right? So I like this type of scale. And here you see some of the results. Unfortunately, this was the only thing I could really find on the internet right now, is only the percentage of people who answered that they were very happy, so the extreme response scale. So you can find your own favorite country, right? But here you see that in Indonesia, well, lots of people are really very happy. On the other hand, Hungary, there are very few people who are very happy. Germany here, 16% of people are very happy. And the United States, 28% of all people are very happy. So anyway, this is a ranking. Well, okay, that's fine. Let's look at another example, because there are lots of studies about happiness if you really go and search for this. So this is a study from the European Survey of Quality of Life, which is again not some sort of global study, right? This is quite a decent study that's being done. And here you see all kinds of happiness figures. Right, what they did ask is that they asked the happiness scale on the scale from 1 to 10. So they used a different scale. Right? Where 1 stands for you are very unhappy and 10 means you are very happy. And here they try to get to a mean score. So it's not the percentage of people that says they're very happy, but it's overall people, how happy are they overall. So it's really hard to compare these numbers, but of course you can compare the ranking. Right? So who are the happiest people in Europe? The Danish people, right? Followed by the other Scandinavians. Then you find Netherlands here, some other countries, and Germany is here, right? And Hungary here, well, Hungary is quite low again, so that seems quite fine. People in Bulgaria and Macedonia are, of course, are less happy, but they weren't included, I think, in the previous survey, right? There's no Macedonia, so perhaps this is all fine. Right? That seems to be okay. Right, let's go on to the next survey. The World Value Survey. This is really a very big study, also I think very well conducted in a way. Look at this ranking. So who do we see on top? The Danish again, right? Consistent with the previous survey. So you're all very happy. So who's second? Puerto Rico, Iceland, Switzerland, some countries. Where do we find Germany? Well, we find only West Germany and East Germany, so they split the two parts, which makes it kind of hard to say where Germany is as a whole. So here's West Germany, here's East Germany, they're sort of halfway. So let's see where we find Hungary. Right, where's Hungary again? Do we find Hungary? No, do we find any of the other? Here's Hungary, it's quite low, right? Some other countries here, Bosnia, USA is really here quite high. So I mean, there are lots of rankings here. Which of these rankings to take and which one to believe, right? Are people now in Colombia really happier than they are in Iceland? Are they really happier in Austria than they are in El Salvador? Right? Or what is this for? Why are people in Hungary so unhappy? Right? We have some people in the room who teach, of course, about cross-national surveys, and they can tell you a lot more than I can about these surveys and why you sometimes do find consistent results. Danish people are apparently the happiest people on the planet. But if you look down into these results, you will also find lots of inconsistencies. Right? You would find, so where's Sweden here on this map? Right? Where's Sweden? What happened? Norway here is now quite down here. Right? Norway is quite low if you compare it to the previous one here, where Norway was almost as high as Denmark. There was hardly any difference between Norway and Denmark. Here there is quite a sizable difference between Norway and Denmark. So why do we sometimes find differences between these countries? Sometimes we don't, right? Which one should we trust? That's really difficult, right? So what you see is that estimates on any survey estimate that you ask about can vary widely, right? Across surveys, across time, things change. So, and that's even so when produced by respected organizations. I don't mean to ridicule these surveys. I think they are very good surveys, the surveys that I just showed you. I'm just not entirely sure about the first one, the Ipsos survey, but that's only because I don't know that survey so well. I know the other two surveys are actually very good surveys, right? And if I would show you some examples of bogus market research organization topics, all these differences that I show you will only be much larger. Right? So even very good surveys produce very large differences. Right? And even if you get very small survey errors, it may lead to huge differences in these estimates. And to me, it seems sometimes, if I look at all these kind of things, that it's unclear which survey estimates should you trust and which can you not trust. I mean, can you just trust all of them? What should you do? Should you just take some sort of average over all these happiness indices and then make your own? Or perhaps you should, but what you really should do is you should try to dig in yourself if you really want to know which of these surveys is a good survey and which isn't a good survey. Because at first sight, you wouldn't know. You wouldn't know whether this World Value Survey is better than this Ipsos survey. Right? You can only find out if you really go to their website, see what they do, and only then can you decide for yourself which of these estimates do you want to trust and which do you not want to trust. All right. So, what should we do? How do we get out of this mess? For example, in Iraq, right? How do we get to a sort of better survey profession where we get numbers that sort of all of us can trust a bit more? Well, what I think in general, I think we should do fewer surveys and try to do them well. I get lots of survey requests, mainly by market research agencies, I must say. Right? And if I enter into these surveys, usually they ask me all kinds of questions about products and whether I want to buy them again and whether I recommend them to my friends. Right? I don't know how to give an answer to all these kind of questions, and I'm sure that most other people can't either. They do, right? If you ask people questions, people will give you an answer. So I think that all of this research is just really bogus, and you can't really use that. If I were a firm, a company, and I did a survey like that, I would feel very uncomfortable with any result that I would get out of these surveys. Okay. Another thing that's very important, and that's what the Iraq story I think taught me, is that what is really very important is that you make your data available to everyone. Right? This Lancet study by Gilbert Burnham is still sort of clouded in question marks. Is it really that bad a survey? What happened? Did interviewers fake their answers? Was there something wrong with the sample? We can only really guess because we don't have the actual data. We don't have the actual fieldwork procedures. Right? So we don't know what happened in practice. What were the instructions to the interviewers? These are not known. They're not. No one knows what the instructions for the interviewers are. And so it is very important that you first of all make data available so that other people can study survey errors. They can see, are there survey errors in your survey? Are they large or small? And document your procedures. That's very important as well. And there are two other points that I didn't make yet, and that I will use a few minutes for from now on to illustrate. What you can also do, of course, is that you can design surveys in such a way that they give insight yourself into the survey errors that might be there in your survey. Right? It's very hard to assess non-response error and measurement error and all these kinds of errors in surveys. But there are ways to do that. And finally, what I think, and this is not a point that I came up with, but that others came up with, and maybe at the last ESRA conference, which was a conference for survey researchers, there was a lot of debate following a keynote talk by one of the speakers that really argued that when you model your data, right, you want to answer your survey questions, you do some analysis in SPSS or in data, that you should do that, but you should really take into account any errors that are there in your data. You can't just not do that anymore. And I very much agree with that, and I want to make that point again today, so I'll illustrate that as well. Okay, so how can you study survey errors? If you want to know more about survey errors in your own data, or you know in advance that you want to know about that, what can you do about that? Well, what's very nice is that you have the first here, if you have validation data. This is sort of the holy grail of survey research, right? You ask people a question, but at the same time you already know what their real answers should be. So then when your data come in, you can check, are these data correct? Yes or no? It's very nice if you have that. It doesn't happen very often. However, I do think that we can do a bit more with validation data. We can try to validate our own data in a much better way. Secondly, we can do experiments. Experiments are generally quite easy to do. They're not very costly. They can be a bit costly depending on what type of experiment. They're very easy to do, and they do give you a lot of insight into survey errors. And finally, the point I just made, you should try to model these survey errors. And modeling them is not as difficult as it may sound to you. Okay. So validation data. For example, one of the problems we have in survey research is that we have a lot of trouble investigating what kind of non-response problem there is. So whether there is a non-response bias problem in our survey. Right? What can we do about that? Well, the only way in which we can assess non-response bias is by comparing the people that we have in our sample to our population. So say you want to do a sample among the German population. You know that in Germany about half of the people are male and about half of the people are female, right? It's not exactly half, but it's about half. And so if you know that in your sample you find 60% females and 40% males, there is something wrong. Something went wrong, right? And it's probably due to non-response. Females are maybe more likely to respond than males. So you know that there is some non-response bias there. Right, so what you ideally want is you want some data at the level of the population against which you can check your survey results. Survey methodologists do this quite often with, for example, with gender, right, with age as well. We know about how many 80-year-olds there live in Germany, so we can check that. Again, we also know how many people live in each region, so we can ask that in our sample, and then we can check, is this fine as well. However, I think we can do much more. Right? What we also know is how many, or we could know at least, is how many people in Germany are a member of a trade union. Maybe if this is not publicly available data, at least the trade unions know how many members they have. Right? So you can ask in your survey, are you a member of your trade union, if that's related to the topic of your survey, if it's about economics, for example. And then check whether is that true, yes or no. You can ask, what party did you vote for in the last election? We know the election results the last time, right? So we ask that question, we should find sort of the election results in our survey as well. And if not, we know that, for example, people who voted for the CDU are underrepresented in my survey, which can be important if you do a survey about things related to politics. Even questions like, do you have a Facebook account? I'm not sure whether this is true in Germany, but at least in the Netherlands, it is known how many Facebook accounts people in the Netherlands there are with Facebook accounts. People living in the Netherlands. It's not the same as Dutch people, but I don't know. You can ask, do you have any biological children? It's also known how many children there are, like how many children there are. Do you own a mobile phone? If there are any data about the number of mobile phones, number of people with mobile phones. Do you have phone? Do you have an internet connection? I'm not sure whether on all these things it's so easy to get population estimates, but I think we should try to see, especially related to the topic of your survey, whether you can find some population statistics that are available that you can create, and then that you can check your survey against, so you can get a better idea of what non-response errors are. And finally, there are people actually that try to use what I call a modern approach, like what is called an R indicator, which is a representativity indicator, to summarize all this information on all these different variables, whether it is representative or no or not, into one specific number. And so you get a number out of your survey in between 0 and 1, indicating how representative your survey is on a range of variables that you have checked. I think if we do that more often, right, if we routinely calculate things like an R indicator, we are at least able to compare surveys to each other. Right? Is this survey a better survey than the other survey? Based on the variables, of course, that they checked for. So it's not the solution for everything, but I think it is definitely a start. Okay, experiments. I won't talk about this too much because there is a wonderful summer course here about survey experiments in 2 weeks' time. So you should all go there. Is it next week already? Sorry. You should all go there if you're here next week. But it's full. Okay. Sorry then. Next year, right? Survey experiments. They're relatively easy to do. Right? It's not very difficult to, for example, if you want to experiment with a question, right? There are 2 versions of a question. You do one half of your questionnaire. You do one of the questions. In the other half, you do the other question. You can see what kind of difference do you get. This is an indication of whether there is a difference in, for example, measurement error between the 2 questions. Right? You can also vary your fieldwork procedures. Right? So you can vary with, for example, the number of reminders you send people. Survey researchers do already a lot of this, right? Experiments. But I think we cannot do this enough to learn more about what works, what doesn't, and also what reduces things like non-response bias. Okay, so experiments I think are very important. Finally, what is very important is to model these survey errors, right? And for those of you who are taking a course in structural equation modeling this week, you know all about this, right? That you can do this very easily. For those of you who don't know about this, I think it is really worthwhile to take a course in a topic like structural equation modeling. It's very useful. So for those of you who are not into structural equation modeling, I'll guide you through what you see here. You see actually some grayed out parts that I grayed out because I thought then the graph would look a bit too scary. Right? So I want you to focus only on these black parts here. Right? So here you see what is called a latent variable called teacher practices. So it's something that you want to measure. Right? And it was actually measured in different ways with some variables. So you see that this construct was measured using 4 variables here. The same goes for professional development. So how teachers developed themselves professionally. Again, measured with 3 questions. Now, this relation is usually the relation that you're interested in as a substantive researcher. You want to know whether teachers that develop themselves more often, that do more to train themselves to become better teachers, whether they also do a better job in the end. If you're in educational research, this is the type of research question that you want to ask. However, you know that this relationship between these 2 variables will be biased, will be wrongly estimated if there is measurement error in either this variable or this variable. So what you really should do is you should try to model the measurement errors that is present in this variable and this variable. And you can do that relatively easy by just asking multiple questions, which we do anyway in most cases. Right? And modeling that into one framework, as you see here. Right? So here you get all kinds of estimates for the measurement error here and here as well. And by doing that in this same framework, you actually correct for measurement error. So the relationship between this variable and this variable will be corrected for measurement error. It will not be biased. It will be a much better estimate. Right? And as a side benefit, this relationship is usually stronger as well. Right? So if you're a substantive researcher, this must appeal to you that you get stronger effects when you correct for measurement error. And although this looks scary, I promise you that if you take a one-week course, you are well able to do this, as the people who take the structural question modeling course will be able to confirm on Friday. Okay. So again, to sort of reiterate what I already said, never take study results for granted. Don't accept, I think, that other people don't publish their data. Right? So I get asked sometimes to review articles in any discipline, sociology or psychology or whatever. What I have now committed myself to, and doing that here on camera, is that whenever I get a review request, I won't accept the paper unless the data are publicized. Right? There are some exceptions, of course, if it is a medical journal with very privacy sensitive data, then of course I understand that these can't be published, all the data. But I think if it is a sociological study or a psychological study, for example, why not publish your data? You should really do that. Right? So I won't accept any papers that don't do that. Right? If not on the public, at least to me as a reviewer. And I think other people should do this too. I think it should become general practice that all the data that we collect are publicly available. So publish your own data as well. Whether it is at GESIS if you're in Germany or your National Data Archive, I think almost all countries have a very good National Data Archive now where you can do this. Right? Also, apart from publish your own data, also make sure that you publish your codebooks, your fieldwork logs, your questionnaire, and if it is up to me, also your analysis scripts for your research. So that actually people outside can check what you did, how you got to the results that are in your table. Right? Of course, this will mean that it might be the case that people point out to you that you did something wrong, right, somewhere. The risk of that is much greater if you publish all of this. Right? However, I think that that's what we are in for science, right? We're here to, in the end, find the truth. That's what we should be in for, I think. And so, of course, it will lead you maybe to someone pointing out that you did something wrong, but then, of course, you can do it better the next time, or you can correct for it. At least you know, right? And if everyone would do this, I think the social science will improve, really. Right. Okay. So, what happened to this other guy, right, that I showed you at the beginning? So no one knew who this is, which is great. I will reveal it now, who he is. His name is Diederik Stapel. He's Dutch. I'm Dutch as well, so there's a reason why I showed him. There's quite a lengthy Wikipedia page about him, so you can check it here. Right? It's full of juicy details about his life. He was professor of social psychology, the dean of the social science faculty of Tilburg University in the Netherlands, and I must say, I think the most famous psychologist we had in the Netherlands. He published over 50 peer-reviewed journals in the last 15 years in really top-ranked journals. So Nature, Science, Psychological Review, all kinds of top-ranked psychological journals. So he was really famous. Until it turned out that actually all the studies that he did used faked data sets and faked analysis results. So what he literally did is he typed in his own tables, right? He just created them. Let's make a table. Let's think about some numbers, or take some data sets. Let's sit behind SPSS and type in some numbers. And he was very quite good at that, right? So he knew how to type in his data in such a way that they would lead to good results. I think that is already quite an achievement. But the point I want to make here, and that's crucial, he was able to do this for 15 years. right? And it was only discovered after his own PhD students alarmed other people, right? Because he also created data for his PhD students. PhD students came up with a research question, and then he would say, oh, that's really good, I still have a data set about that. I will send it to you in 2 days. And then, so after all, some PhD students really thought that this was probably wrong somewhere, and they went to another superior, and then it all came out. Right? But it didn't come out in all this peer review that we do in science. Right? So he wrote these 50 articles, perhaps even more, some got rejected. He wrote 50 articles in really some of the best journals that we have, right? But there should be really a fail-proof peer review procedure. But apparently there was no reviewer that asked to see the data, that replicated this analysis, right? Because you actually, and there was a commission investigating him, and the commission actually stated that if this had happened, any real reviewer that knew a little bit about data analysis could have seen that this data were faked, because they were all the same numbers, right? Every respondent would have the same numbers, so that in the end the results would really come out the way he wanted to. Right? So all these data sets, it would have been really easy to discover his fraud. But it was just because no one ever asked for the data and for his scripts and for his fieldwork protocols, written questionnaires, anything, that he came away with it for so long. I mean, he's captured now. But the moral of the story really is that in survey research, I think we can do a better job. What we don't do, I mean, I don't think that we do something like this. I would be highly surprised if this would happen for any of these survey projects that I showed you, right? Because for most of them, the data are available, or at least the questionnaires are available. It is much harder to fake your data in survey research than it is in psychology. So I think they might have more catching up to do with if they're really, yeah, in my view. So that's it. If you have any questions or remarks, you can always email me at this address. Or I have a website as well where you can also ask questions or post comments or read some of the things that I do when I'm not here at GESIS. So thank you, and I hope it's about time to go up to the roof. Not yet. Not yet.
You get roof with questions first.
Exactly. So.
Right, I know that Eric is getting a little bit stuffy here, but I think it was a very interesting presentation, and I'm also very now how many people came to see it, and so I think we should collect a few questions, and because I think there's lots of things that we can be more curious about. Anybody wants to start? Well, yeah, everybody's addressed, but it is also some small. Very consistent. Yes, please. Please also say on
which she's from University in Europe. I was wondering which version is correct about the deaths in Iraq.
Right, so the question is, in the end, I didn't answer that question, right? The question is, which of these 4 surveys is correct, right, in Iraq? I think the second survey. I could say something like, you don't know, you never know which one is correct. Right? But let's not do that. I'll say the second survey is probably the most correct there is, in my view. So this was, to remind you, the Iraq Family Health Survey, which was actually UN WHO sponsored. They did a thorough job there. They used, it did suffer from some weaknesses, that study, especially the sampling frame was very old. But I think that estimate of 150,000 is quite credible, first of all, and they did a very good job. And on first sight, I think this other study that I did show you looked good as well. But there's just such a large difference between these estimates, 150,000 and 630,000, that only after that people started to investigate and criticize this 4th study. Right? And with the second study, I'm not sure whether it received the same type of scrutiny as well. So that's why I'm not entirely sure that survey is really the better one, but if you'd ask me right now, I'd opt for that one.
Thank you. More questions? Please, Hassan.
You emphasize very much the need to make sure that you get approximately
provide some information. So I think that depends also on the field of what I see, especially in experimental research, social psychology, or anything else, but especially for experiments. They don't do any such thing as samples. I know we're talking mainly about surveys, but some of the experiments are sort of surveys. So they use amographs and yes committees and whatever. Do you think that's classifiable for, I don't know, whatever theoretical reasons?
So the question is, in social psychology, a lot of the research is being done with university students or undergraduate students. Is that fine or not?
Yeah, well, it doesn't matter so much as, for example, in the Iraqi thing, whether you really have a representative sample of population, for example.
Interestingly, I had a long conversation about this with my co-teacher this week, Annelies Blom, yesterday over lunch, and arguing that if this, well, what psychologists would say to you is that people are just people and they function in the same way. Right? So it doesn't matter whether you interview someone who's 40-year-old or 20-year-old, psychologically they work in the same way. Things like personality, right? You have a personality, doesn't matter if you're 20-year-old or 40-year-old, it doesn't change very much. They would say it might change a little, but not very much. That's what psychologists would say to you. And well, perhaps they're right, I think, but what I think they should do, psychologists, is show this in articles. Right? So they should publish articles where they actually repeat studies that they do on undergraduate studies, repeat them among other populations, and show actually that these results are the same. And I think once there are enough studies that show this, I mean, let's say if there are 20 studies that show this, then I believe them as well. But currently there are only a few studies that do this, that compare undergraduate student populations results to general population results, and the studies that are there actually show that there are differences between the two populations. Right? So I would say the evidence so far was against them, but I'm happy to be convinced that they do a good job.
Thank you. I think this is a really interesting discussion also to compare methods across fields of study, really, because we, well, in these experiments, part of these are surveys or use survey elements, and we use partly experiments as well. So that is extremely interesting also. And, further questions, please. Could you also introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, I'm Alice Marsh from the University of Bonn, and I was wondering about the validation data you pointed out. So how do you make sure the validation data is valid as well? I mean, you have like Facebook accounts. I know that very many people have fake Facebook accounts, so they have 2 or 3 accounts. The same thing with mobile phones, and even like census data might not be really valid. It turned out in Germany that there are 1 million people less than expected when they did a real census about 12, and they calculated with, the wrong numbers, like more than 10 years. So how do you make sure that you use the right validation data?
So the question is really, can we always use validation data and trust the validation data that they are actually true? Because there might be problems with validation by themselves. I think this is a very valid point. Many of the validation data that we have might not be as good as we think they are. I do think, however, that many validation data are at least better than we have as survey estimates. Right? So although they might not be perfect, they are I would say good enough. Right? And so, for example, I know that in official statistics, so now making another bridge to for example, statistical agencies, there is this tendency that instead of using surveys, to use registry data. Because in government and administrative registers, there's more and more that we register as people. So you can use all of that data. And I know they do research on this topic as well, and they often find that even these registers have problems. Right? They're not updated frequently enough, or they're outdated, or well, lots of problems with these as well. However, if you overall, I think, look at the quality of the good registers that we have very bad ones as well, but we have some registers available generally that are very good. And although if we know that there are some problems with them, I think they are much better than some of the survey data that we collect. So yes, I think there are problems with validation data, but what we can do is try to improve those, right? So we can try to improve those validation data, and until that moment, I think we can use validation data if we are reasonably sure that they're correct. So you gave an example about Facebook accounts. Lots of people might have not one Facebook account, but 2 or 3, or have fake ones, or these kind of things. That's something that before using these validation data, you should of course check, right, whether this is true. And it might be hard to do that, but if you're unsure, of course you shouldn't use these kind of validation data.
It's very interesting because the validation data very often is not very well documented, because we don't know how exactly these registers come about and how they are treated and updated. And if that information is missing, you cannot really do the evaluation of the other data that you want to take into account. Dominique?
Yes, just to continue on this point, I think the discussion of validation data are really important. But one point perhaps has to be mentioned, and normally you have to think also to the relation between the validation data and the points, the central interest variables of your survey. And so if there are no relation between validation data and the central point of your survey, perhaps it's not so a good idea to put the high trust in validation data. Of course, if you can suppose some relation with your key variables and your validation data, that's another story. So we need also something which is a theory of the links between different fields that we can use in the survey, just to be a little bit more sure about what we are doing by using this kind of accessory additional information. But of course it's open to debate. But I'm not sure that representative survey according to the traditional criteria mean that for your key variables, your survey necessarily representative as well. And when you dispute about the R indicators and so on, I think we have also to take into account on which field these variables are referring to.
Right, so am I right in interpreting your point, or summarizing it in the sense that you state that for example, R indicators, we would use different indicators across different studies, depending on the survey topic?
Yeah.
No? Can you maybe then repeat the question?
Oh, it's more a comment on the question. But if you take the critical point of view, that I fully agree that you must be very critical of your survey, we have also to think which is the relation between the validation criteria that we take and the key variables in which we are interested to measure. And you can have very strong relation in some cases, and so in this case probably validation criteria are perfect. But there are also many cases where we don't have validation criteria which are related to the point that we want to measure. And in this case, we need to be much more careful about what we are doing and the way we interpret, for example, R indicators in this kind of context.
Right. With that point, I very much agree. So I do believe indeed that if you do a survey about, for example, some attitudes, right, that these are very often not related to things like gender or the region where you live in or someone's age, right? Or if they are related, very weakly so. And so if you would compute an R indicator, the R indicator wouldn't necessarily say something about the quality of the thing you're interested in. However, I think then we should collect other validation data or more validation data and search for types of validation data that are generally related to things we are interested in. And I think as social scientists, we are generally interested in things like attitudes, behaviors, these kind of things. And these are weakly related to the facts that we try to find out. But for example, voting behavior, for which we do have validation data, I think would be a candidate to use more often in these kind of things.
Can I also ask a question here and maybe play devil's advocate? Because on the one slide you said, well, we should do fewer and better surveys. But now you're also asking that we have multiple indicators so that we can measure measurement error and model it. You say you want to collect extra validation data.
Yes.
That would mean we have to cut down on the substantive topics we actually want to do research on. So I can guess that we could have great debates upstairs later on which topics to scrap from our agendas.
Yes, so I think the general point is right? We there are all these things that we also want to know, right? And that there are more and more things because we want to know, because our societies become more complex and it becomes more important to have knowledge for all kinds of reasons. However, I do think, for example, that if you just Google happiness survey and you count the number of surveys that somehow, whether it is the main objective or not the main objective, try to measure happiness around the world. There are really so many of them. And I just wonder whether all of them are necessary, or whether we should probably focus our resources and just design one survey. Well, I think the survey is already there. It's probably the world value survey. And do that as good as we can.
Yes, but on the other hand, having multiple data sources also allows you to check those against each other, and one survey is validation data for the other. So I think that's really kind of a tricky issue to really decide how to...
Yes, but I think it's much better to have one very good survey instead of 3 not very good surveys. That's, I think, the main point.
So that's the opposite of Zara's point of rather having 2 bad variables than one good one?
No, so surveys, not about surveys, not about questions. So I think,
Sorry, that's getting confusing. Do we have some questions from the chat, maybe from the people who are following us online? I've seen Fernanda, for example, making a few
it's
points.
rather a comment. So I will just bring, I will be Fernanda's voice for now. And it's going back to the issue of an experiment that we had before, but because here we have some sort of a lack of time, like a lack in terms of time, so I forget that. So Fernanda is saying that a lot of psychologists, while conducting surveys, assume that measurement error only affects questionnaires. And her opinion is that, well, when you conduct an experiment, it's also a relevant question to ask, because you can also make errors while selecting your participants and also constructing your items for your questions, for instance.
Yes, so thanks, Fernanda, for your question. I think it's very true that measurement error is not only something that occurs in surveys, but also in experiments, because in experiments usually there is some form of surveys as well, right? You ask something to people to do and they give a response. Sometimes it's not an answer to a question, but they do a kind of task on the computer, for example. And if they misinterpret that task, it's sort of the same thing as a misinterpretation of a survey question.
Well, there's no measurement without measurement error.
Exactly.
If you put a measuring stick here to the table, there will be measurement error. So I guess that's a very general point to take away for everybody.
Yes.
So, further questions or comments?
We have one more question.
Okay, we have more time.
That's from Marianne, and he or she, I'm sorry for that, is saying, thank you very much for this talk. The question, when you recommend making data available during the review process, what would you say to people who might be hesitant about making data available before they have published about it, on it?
Right, that's a very good question. So the question is, some people might be hesitant about publishing their data because they want to publish themselves with the data. And they're a bit afraid that other people, okay, now I'm maybe exaggerating a little bit, but might steal the data and might publish very quickly before you do yourself. And then you spend all this time collecting the data and someone else runs away with the results. Right, this is a bit exaggerated, but this is sort of the argument that many people would give. Well, first of all, I think you should not be so scared. It's really not very often that there is this researcher that is really waiting for your data to get published and then quickly analyze it and publish this before you do. I mean, I don't think that it works that way. Maybe with some very specific and rare data, right? So maybe not in the field of social science, but I can imagine that if you do, say, a medical study, right, that lots of people are waiting for this study to be completed. So there I can maybe see the point. But for example, in sociology or in psychology, I don't think that's necessarily the case. And I'm not saying that you should publish the data right after they come in, right? I think it is fine if you take some time to get to know your data, to clean your data. Someone has to do this. I think that it is important. Do some analysis on it to see if you find any further results. And for example, publish your data only, say, 6 months or so after you've finished collecting it. I think that's fine, there's no problem with it. But I do think that at some point your data should really be published. And preferably before the article really appears in a journal. So.
Great, thank you. Any questions further now, or should we just continue discussing upstairs when we have drinks in our hands? I think Peter's looking forward to it as well. Thank you very much again for coming. Sorry for some very brief interruptions, maybe because we're streaming this talk on the internet, which we will also do for the next talks, when some of you may already have left the summer school. We have next week a talk about quality assurance in the European Social Survey, which I think really well connects with your talk. And you can, for example, watch it online and comment. And I will also briefly talk about the method of education in that survey as well, and the comparison with validation data from official surveys, so that you actually have lots of connecting points. And if somebody still wants to learn more about understanding and modeling amendment errors and has been in the structural iteration rate modeling course this week, we still have spaces in the course that Jacques Lillard will be giving next week. So if you cannot get enough from structural iteration models and measurement error models, you can learn more next week if you like. Great. Otherwise, I would say thanks a lot again for coming, and see you upstairs in a few minutes. And thanks again for Peter.